Chapter 24 of Workers Together. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Workers Together, or an Endless Chain, by Pansy. Chapter 24. Decisions and Perplexities. But the dinner was late, unaccountably so. The little housekeeper who had it all to do tried her best, but the wind was contrary, and the fire refused to burn as promptly as it should, and puffed out clouds of smoke at her, until her eyes were red. Then in her hurry she spilled the hot water, pouring some of it on her poor little hand. After that she tried hard to keep back the tears over the smarting, while she hurried the dinner, lest Austen should be tired waiting. What trivial causes were detaining the brother? He thought the question of going was settled, but it unsettled itself the moment he took a seat beside his mother and began to talk of indifferent things. She was not in the mood to talk of indifferent things. The very sound of her voice seemed to press upon him the subject from which he was trying to get away. He went, at last, out into the tiny summer kitchen to help the little housekeeper. This was what he was in the habit of doing, and she had wondered over his not coming. But while he was giving his entire attention to the broiling of the bit of steak, she said, "Austen, don't you hope that poor young man was a Christian? And yet I am afraid he wasn't. He wouldn't have been on the train on Sunday if he had been good, would he?" Then, blushing scarlet over her blundering, the little woman said, "Oh, Austen, I don't mean that, you know. I mean, well, oh, Austen, you know Christians don't travel on Sunday." He tried to laugh at her confusion, and told her that he guessed she didn't know what she meant, and that the steak was broiled, and so was he. Then he hurried away from the kitchen. There was no safe spot in that house. When the dinner was finally over, and he had helped Janey with the heavy things, it was too late to think of going to the gardens. He felt half glad about it. They had no attraction for him. A dozen topics of conversation he started, but his mother, gentle, patient, would not talk about them other than to give the simplest answers, which left no chance for continuing. At last the little sister finished her work in the summer kitchen, then stole away somewhere, seeming to realize that in that room there were forces at work which she must not disturb by careless words. The young man had yielded again to the restlessness which possessed him, and was walking up and down the narrow space, trying not to think. Yet he thought. There was a great battle being fought that day. Very few human beings knew or indeed ever heard of it. But the legions of darkness, and the hosts of heaven, and one mother, and one son, knew all about it. By and by a whistle sounded in the distance. Austen looked at the little clock in the corner, at his watch, then at his mother. "Never mind the train, my son," the mother said. "Let it go." "I shall lose the return fare, mother, unless I go in this train or the next one." "Never mind the fare. Money is of the very smallest consequence just now. Settle this question, dear boy. Don't let anything come between." "Settle what question, mother?" But he needed no answer. He knew what his mother considered the most important question in life. Also he knew that money was scarce in that cottage. "I will go on the next train, I think," he said doubtfully. "The excursion tickets are taken on that one, and it doesn't go for an hour yet." "My dear son, do not wait another hour before you decide this matter. You do not know that you have an hour to spare." Then there was silence again, and thinking and praying in that little room. The clock ticked, and the soft wind blew and scattered rose leaves about the room, and the mother leaned back in her rocker and made no outward sign, but her bleeding heart said, "O Christ of Galilee, thou who didst have compassion on that mother at the gates of Nain, he is the only son of his mother, and she is a widow. Let it be now, Lord, now." Could we but have looked into heaven during that solemn hour, what would we have seen and heard there? The angels, you know, must have been watching. Probably they waited in suspense the result of the battle. But he who was to see the travail of his soul and be satisfied, needed not to wait as the mother did. But long before, Austen Barrows went over to her side and said, "Mother, will you pray for me?" He knew that the conflict was over, that once again he had battled with Satan for a soul, and had won. Less than an hour afterward the whistle of the second excursion train sounded. But Austin's mother, with smiling eyes, said, "Let it go, my son. Men who pray, you know, have no place on a Sunday train." So the excursion train swept out of the city with 2 passengers less than it carried in the morning. To both of them the Christ of Nain had spoken. To the one, "This day thy soul shall be required of thee." To the other, "Young man, I say unto thee, arise." Meantime, Dr. Everett, all unaware of what God was doing, passed these 2 young men on Monday, met them indeed several times, and as soon as he did so, he let his mind wander sadly over the hopes he had had for them, and the efforts he had made to reach them. He believed that all had thus far been in vain, and while he was not exactly discouraged, he was certainly sad and disappointed. He thought himself thoroughly posted as to the events of the Sabbath just past. He knew that Robert Parks had wandered away from the church, which of late he had been in the habit of attending, and had gone in disreputable company. It was very apparent that Hester Mason was the one who had influence with him. If something could only be done for her. But Joy Saunders had failed, so what was there to hope for? The doctor would have been ashamed of himself had he put that thought into words. The fact is, we have many thoughts that will not bear voicing. As for Austin Barrows, the doctor knew that he had joined the Sunday excursionists without apparently having the excuse of being led in that direction by Robert Parks. From his standpoint, this seemed a rapid downward stride, and so perhaps it was not to be wondered at that he felt more than usually disheartened, and passed and repassed the young men several times without attempting to speak with them. His professional duties were crowding him during these days, so that he rarely met Robert at the table. I would not have you understand that the young gentlemen in question were together. The truth is that during the earlier days of that eventful week they carefully avoided each other's society. Perhaps Austin Barrows had good reason for this course. He realized that he had been led astray by young Parks, and he did not yet feel strong enough to meet the ridicule to which he believed he would be subject. Why Robert Parks should avoid him would perhaps be more difficult to explain, save that Robert had an idea that a radical change of associates was necessary for him. It was Monday evening, and Dr. Everett, who had been planning all day with a view to a leisure hour, having succeeded, spent it in Miss Mason's parlor. Sorely perplexed was Dr. Everett. Was he, as a superintendent, doing all that he could for a girl like Hester Mason, if he left her under the influence of such a teacher? Yet how could he make any changes? Miss Mason had her story to tell. It was not encouraging. The girls had never seemed so listless and uninterested as on the previous Sabbath. "I tried really hard," said the poor teacher, "and I couldn't do a thing with them. They would talk about their gloves and their bonnets, and Dr. Everett, that Hester Mason does try me beyond anything. It is queer that a girl like her should have such an influence in the class. You would think they would feel superior to her, but it almost seems as though they copied her. Anyhow, when she chatters, the rest of them do." "She seems to have a great deal of influence over her associates," admitted the doctor, "and for that reason, among others, I wish we could reach her. She has a very decided character, and might be a power for good. Perhaps we ought to feel less discouraged about her when we remember the teaching she has had. I mean that less ought to be expected of her." "Well," Miss Mason said, so far as that was concerned, she was sure she expected very little of her. If the girl would only stay away from the class altogether, she would feel that she had done the best thing she could for all concerned. As for influencing her to behave herself, she had not the least hope of it. She didn't believe she knew how, or wanted to know. And then the doctor began to feel sure that he was not doing his duty by Hester Mason. Think of leaving her with a teacher whose strongest wish concerning her was that she might stay away. Suppose he should remove her to another class. The probabilities were very strong that she would take offense, and remove herself from the Sabbath school. Slight as was her attachment to the school, it was associated, of course, with that particular corner of the room, and that set of girls; and she was just the one to resent interference. Besides, poor man, he cast about hurriedly to see where he would place her, supposing he saw his way clear to making a change. But not a class presented itself as the wise place for this stray sheep. There could be no possible assimilation between the girls of Joy Saunders's class and this one. Mrs. Saunders was teaching boys, and besides did not like Hester; and, in short, there was some excellent reason why she should not have a place in any class of which he could think. The fact was, Miss Mason ought to be removed, and a suitable teacher set in her place. But how to accomplish the removal, and where to find the suitable teacher to take her place? There was at that moment something like a groan in the superintendent's heart, and if he had given it voice it would have said, "Oh, Miss Mason, Miss Mason, if you could only be made over! If your love for poor Hester's periled soul was so great that you would cling to her despite all obstacles, and cry to God continually for her rescue, you would be the teacher for her above all others." Then immediately there came to his own heart the question, "Have you prayed in this way for Hester Mason? Have you prayed in this way for Hester Mason's teacher? Do you believe that God is able to change the heart of the one and renew the zeal of the other? And if you do, why don't you cry to him to do it?" He sat silent for so long a time that Miss Mason wondered what was in his mind. At last he told her. Chapter 25. Recording by Trisha G.